So Jim, let me go ahead and turn it over to you. Do you want to give us like a 30-second intro and then go ahead and do your presentation?
Sure. So can you see the climate crisis opening screen?
Yep.
Okay. Well, as Jenny pointed out, I've been a member of Citizens Climate Lobby for a number of years. It started in Houston. Still a sustaining member, but after the last election, when 74 million of my fellow citizens voted to re-up a xenophobic, autocratic, incompetent as commander-in-chief, I thought maybe the United States military might be as big a threat as climate change. And I'm a research geologist. I know climate change is a major, it's a critical problem, but that's how worried I have been. So let me go ahead and Garrett Reppenhagen is our executive director, and I think he gives a good summary of the problem. Is essentially what he says is we need to do more than make our military more sustainable and to declare the climate crisis a threat multiplier in confronting terror. We need leaders that acknowledge the threat is our own military emissions. And there is no such thing as a green war. I think it's intuitively obvious, but again, the amount of support that's going to our military, sometimes I question this. There is no military solution to the climate crisis, and greenwashing isn't gonna hack it. I don't need to go. It's code red for humanity. I know Mary can't see this, but we all know. I've been working with you folks for many years. We know, and based on what's been happening in this last year, I actually feel survivor's guilt living in Michigan compared to what my friends and a lot of folks I work with is on the West Coast and what they're having to deal with. Now I'm going to go over, we have 4 major areas of focus, and I'm going to go over all of these. Our first area of focus is the carbon footprint. We like Veterans for Peace. And actually, I've been a member of Veterans for Peace even longer than Citizens Climate Lobby. I started during the Iraq War when I joined in Texas. But the carbon footprint of the US military is larger than that of many countries. In fact, it would be ranked 47th if it were a country on its own. And if you include the military-industrial complex, you could almost double that. Now, we're demanding that the Pentagon set a clear greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the Department of Defense that are consistent with the 2015 Paris goals of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. And the Pentagon must commit to greenhouse gas emission reporting that is robust and verifiable for all domestic and overseas US military. Now, this is actual text from a draft that Representative Barbara Lee, California, is putting together. We've been working with her since July on this particular resolution. I feel very proud to be working with Representative Lee. She's probably noticed, been in the news. She was a lone vote against the Afghanistan war. She's also an endorser of the EIC DA, so just so you know that. Now, to give you some context or some actual examples of the degree of emissions, just 1 hour of operating a B-52 is equal to 7 cars driving for a year, okay, or 1 car driving for 7 years, so the average car. We all like to go to air shows. I remember taking my son to one, but a typical air show would equate to 25 cars driving for a year. That's the level of emissions, and that's just for an air show. Now, the DoD emissions that I'm going to be talking about are estimates. Official totals are not released. The only mandates that DoD has to report is on facilities, domestic facilities, which only accounts for about 33%. And let me note, I really didn't realize this, that the Kyoto Protocols back in '97 the United States demanded that military missions for all countries not be included. And that was negotiated, if you recall, by Clinton and Gore. And of course, Bush pulled out. Now, in the Paris Climate Agreement, it's only voluntary. Countries don't have to report their emissions. Now let's look at the degree of emissions. And this is from a Forbes article. So not exactly coming from Greenpeace or anything like that. This is a 2017 emissions. It's estimated the US military emitted 59 million metric tons, which put it above Morocco, Peru, Sweden. Like I said, it was 47th if it were considered a nation. Now, what does 59 million metric tons mean? An MMT, many of you know, is million metric tons. Well, there was a recent article in the New York Times, a carbon calculation. How many deaths, how many deaths do emissions cause? And this was based on a Nature article. I think Bresler was the author of the research paper. But essentially what he did was he took the emissions and he kind of figured out what the excess deaths would be between 2020 and 2100. So essentially he calculated that it'd be 93 or 900 or 9,350 metric tons would create one death. That's a lot of carbon, but so if you multiply that times the 59 million metric tons, that equals out to 63,000 deaths. And again, that would be between 2020 and 2021 or 2100. Well, that's not a lot. I mean, that's like a sixth of what the amount of people that we kill with firearms in a year, but that's another problem I won't get into. But interesting, and again, statistics can be interesting. If you multiply that one number for 1 year by 20 years, which would be the length of the Afghan war, that would result in the same number of casualties as what died in the Afghanistan war on our side. If you multiply that by 30 years, it would, like, so 2020 to 2050, that would result in excess deaths of 500,000. And that's assuming that we're only going to go to 2 degrees. If we go to 4 degrees, the calculations come out to be twice that. So, and that's where we're heading right now. So essentially what that's saying is the US military doesn't even have to go drop bombs on anybody or shoot them with bullets. Just by playing fun and games, war games, doing their normal everyday thing, they're going to result, because of their emissions, in thousands and thousands of deaths, unless we lower their emissions. Best way to lower the emissions, and what I'd be arguing for, and what we're all arguing for, is we need to reduce the size of the military. Focus number 2, wars for oil and other resources and how they support the fossil fuel status quo. I think Exhibit A is the operation in Iraq, maybe Afghanistan also, even though there's no oil there, or not very much oil there. The extensive supply lines, the amount of troops, all this uses an awful lot of oil and gas and creates massive emissions. The other thing is the United States has 800 bases overseas. And in a meeting that we had in April with John Kerry's staff, they essentially volunteered the information that the emissions from these 800 bases are granted or awarded, or however you want to put it, to the host country. So these aren't our emissions. These count towards the emissions of the so-called host countries. Now, we have chapters in some of these host countries, Veterans for Peace does, and we know that a lot of those host countries aren't all that happy in hosting the United States military. But again, we don't count those emissions. Focus number 3, the overwhelming burden of both of the climate crisis and militarism impacts people of color and poor people. And of course, climate change is impacting future generations. Militarism affects vulnerable populations. Majority, 85 to 90% of casualties are civilian casualties. The other thing is that the military and other defense forces are used to keep out immigrants. And what's interesting here is that the countries that historically did the most polluting, like the United States, which was historically 27%, the EU and the UK, Russia, China, these are all countries that are adamant about keeping immigrants out. So it seems to be a contrast here that the most polluting countries are the ones that are most adamant about keeping immigrants out. And I think it was it's the International Organization on Immigration are estimating that by 2050, there'll be 200 million climate refugees. And let me just point out that there is no official designation of climate refugees. That's another thing that has to be done. Of course, that would have to be done by the United Nations. But 200 million, and that's probably a low ball. There's a lot higher figures, what's as far as immigrants resulting from climate change. Focus number 4, the resources spent on militarism and war could be redirected to respond to the existential threat of climate change and also other issues. And this is a big fact here. Okay, this is a pie diagram of the fiscal 2022 budget that was proposed by President Biden. Now, President Trump had he allocated over 50% of the budget towards military, slightly above 50%. Biden reduced this to 50%, but the overall number he increased by tens of billions of dollars. So even though the piece of the pie is smaller, since he grew the pie, the actual amount of money that's going to the military is increasing with Biden versus Donald Trump. And then also at a recent meeting of the hearing of the Armed Services Committee, they voted to increase the budget even more by, I think, about over $20 billion. And the people, even some Democrats voted for that, including Michigan's own Alyssa Slotkin. So more money on top of vast amounts of money for the military. Now, what is a real military budget? And I won't go into all of these. The Department of Defense is really only, it's 550, and this is based on 2019 figures in the nation. So 550 billion. The war budget is another 174 billion, so that gets up over to 700 billion. Veterans Affairs is 200 billion, which we certainly don't want to decrease that. In fact, that probably needs to be increased. The last item on this list, defense share of the national debt, that's $156 billion. So what does that all add up to? That adds up to $125 trillion for essentially military portion of the budget. And I suppose you could, that really didn't help out the 600,000 or 650,000 people that have died of COVID. Certainly was very cost effective in Afghanistan. And again, these numbers, I want to point out that the Pentagon has failed 3 audits. So these are sort of numbers that are sort of nebulous. We know how much was given to them, but we don't necessarily know how they spent it. So this is some figures from the Brown University Cost of War Project. They estimated that the US spent $6.4 trillion of the past 2 decades on the war on terror. There are estimates that we could go to 100% renewable energy in the next decade with an expenditure of $4.5 trillion. So if we'd taken that 6.4 and instead spent it on converting to renewables, we would have, been able to accomplish that and gotten some change in addition. So instead of funding endless wars, maybe we should funnel that money someplace else. Now, where does a lot of this military money go? Well, over half of that money goes to contractors. Those not all going to soldiers and pilots and sailors. Half of that goes to contractors that are supporting the military. And of course, 100 billion of that goes to the big five, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, and so forth. And we're all lobbyists. We've been, talking to our members of Congress, but I'm sure the lobbyists from Raytheon and Boeing will probably have a lot more heft when they walk in the door to talk to our members of Congress. And of course, the Secretary of Defense is a former executive at Raytheon. Okay, so vast amounts of money. This is our taxpayer money, or if we borrow the money, it's our children's money that they're going to have to spend. How would we spend it instead? Well, there's healthcare. We could forgive student debt. All these people are complaining about, well, we don't have the money to do these things. Clean up Superfund sites, that probably would be a small amount. Adapt to the climate crisis. Also putting money towards the Green Fund to help other nations adapt and also help them clean up the world's climate or the world's atmosphere. So all this money could be diverted to those things instead of the military. Now, why are we giving talks on this? Because a lot of environmental advocates don't necessarily think about the military. It's sort of a sacrosanct thing, even for Democrats. And in fact, I remember some years ago, Bill McKibben, when he was asked about military emissions, he didn't think it was that big of a deal. And if you look at the raw numbers of just the military, it would be maybe 1 or 2% of the total emissions of the United States. But still, the overall effect of the military is much larger than that. Like I said, you can double those numbers when you're talking about the military industrial complex. And let me add that this is slowly changing. We had a letter that went to John Kerry recently that was signed on by hundreds of organizations, essentially asking him to address the military in his climate initiatives. And one of the organizations that signed on was the National 350.org. So our goal is transparency. We think that if the military has to report their emissions, all of their emissions, then people will start to realize, hey, they're really big emitters and we can't just ignore them. We have to include that. And in fact, in a June communique from NATO, all the NATO nations agreed to actually do this. So one of the things we're doing is trying to push Congress to push our Department of Defense to actually follow the guidelines of NATO. So the best way to reduce emissions in the military is not to put LED lights on the rear of a tank or to give solar panels to the military to use. Of course, these things need to be done anyway. But the best way and the only way to really significantly reduce military emissions is to actually reduce the military. Now, we're not the only organization that's calling for this. People over the Pentagon have called for a $200 billion reduction. The Poor People's Campaign have called for a $350 billion reduction in annual funding to the Department of Defense. Now, what would that mean? So the diagram on the right shows the red bar shows that United States military budget this is for 2020, was $737 billion. Well, that is more than the next 10 countries combined. So even if you took the $350 billion reduction and you reduced our Department of Defense budget by that, we would still be spending more than supposedly our next boogeyman, China. So why are we doing this? Especially since, you know, climate change is the major issue. We all know that. It's ridiculous to be spending this kind of money and having these kind of emissions with the military. So what can we do? I mean, what I'm doing is and I'm very happy that I found this group, the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, to put my energy towards. And that's what I'm doing. I'm not just doing climate. I'm also, like I said, I'm worried about our military and its impacts on the world. Like I said, we have a resolution that Barbara Lee said that she's going to be submitting in middle to the end of September. So we have if you go to our website, we have a support the congressional resolution. You can sign up there, or you can just email me to say that you're willing to contact your member of Congress to support this resolution. Now there is a draft of this. When you sign up form, there is an old draft, but we haven't started this campaign because Representative Lee wants to have the final text for the resolution before we start a vigorous campaign to get people to sign on. Now, why should more people that sign on to this resolution, the better chance that there'll be a congressional letter going to John Kerry to tell him to conclude military missions in the COP26 declared reduction target. So that's what we're asking for. And don't let Democrats off the hook. One thing that I want to point out is even Bernie Sanders, very liberal, and the $3.5 billion reconciliation or $1 trillion reconciliation bill includes increases in the military budget, whereas by 2030, the budget would be over $800 billion. So, and if you know some other groups that might want to hear this talk, please let me know. And I want to thank you for your time.